Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Oh, I am late to the party on this particular piece of news, drama, and discussion. I can tell you that for a fact. We did talk a little bit about it on the Thursday podcast, which was released on Saturday, the 21st of November. But we didn't really cover it in great detail, mostly because it was a fairly immediate and unprepared reaction to something that had pretty much happened that day. The article we were discussing was released on the 19th. We went live with the podcast also on the 19th, so there were sort of immediate reactions. Now I've had time to think about it, stew on it a little bit. Everyone else seems to have got their piece in, so I'm definitely arriving late to the party, but we're going to talk about it anyway because it's the kind of topic that I like to discuss. What am I talking about? Well, I am, of course, talking about the claim by Kotaku that they have been blacklisted by Ubisoft and Bethesda, the reasons that they believe this blacklist is in place for, and I'd also like to discuss who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and all that kind of thing, and at least try and bring a little bit of nuance to a discussion that is, for the most part, surrounded by blind tribalism and opinions which seem to be driven more by which site they like and don't like, rather than the overall health of the content creation ecosystem and reporting when it comes to video games. Probably because most people don't actually care about that subject. They only really care about saying ha-ha at people they don't like, which it's cathartic, I get it, don't get me wrong. Now, I have engaged in that in the past. It's a very, very enjoyable thing to do from time to time, but let's break this down, shall we? So, the article was released by Stephen Totilo on the 19th of November, and that was, of course, on Kotaku, called The Price of Games Journalism. It speaks on the subject of an alleged blacklisting of Kotaku by Bethesda and by Ubisoft. I say alleged because there's no actual proof that this blacklist exists. There is no confirmation from either publisher that they have done so. Admittedly, in the vast majority of circumstances, in my experience when it comes to industry blacklists, the people perpetrating said blacklist will not publicly announce that it has happened or talk about it. They will simply ignore you. You know, it's basically stonewalling. This, as far as I can tell, is no different. Kotaku has presented no evidence of a blacklist. They have only presented circumstantial things that have happened, or more accurately have not happened, such as receiving various review copies, not receiving comments back for stories, and so on and so forth, being ignored by PR and marketing wings for these particular companies. Totilo goes on to argue that what they did was for the public good. It was basically what you would expect from any site if they gained access to pieces of information, and the reason that they were blacklisted was most likely the leaking of the forthcoming announcements for Assassin's Creed Victory, which was renamed to Syndicate, which of course came out this year, and Fallout 4, when they were able to acquire leaked information about voice acting for that particular game and basically confirm the existence of it before Bethesda had announced it. They also claim that it's something to do with a little bit of digging they did on the subject of Prey 2 and the Studio Arcane, which is of course under Bethesda, as well as alleged troubles with the development of Doom. These are the things that they point to as the reason why these companies do not wish to talk to them anymore. Now, of course, we have no idea whether or not that's true. It's entirely possible that it's not, but we're going to give them, for the moment anyway, the benefit of the doubt and say that yes, leaking announcements is probably a good way to get publishers to stop talking to you. Now, I've got a number of different opinions on this particular topic, and of course the first one is going to be the obvious one. Publishers have the right to not give information or access to anybody they so desire. There is not a requirement for these publishers to do so at any point. You, as a website, or indeed as a YouTuber, have a right to talk about whatever you damn well please when it comes to these companies, but you don't necessarily have the right to do so using resources that they gave you. Yeah? They don't have to give you the rope by which you will then hang them. That's a fact. That's got nothing to do with my particular opinion on anything to do with this. It is just a fact. Publishers don't have to give you jack. Now, to fill in for those that don't know, getting access to review copies is generally done through PR firms that are hired by the publishers themselves. Sometimes you go direct to the publisher, but more often than not, they're dealing with PR firms such as 47 and a lot of other larger groups whose sole purpose is to liaise with these media organizations, give access to who they feel should have access, and of course not give access to those that they feel should not. Needless to say, we have had a rather strained relationship with a lot of these companies over the past few years because YouTubers in particular have been battling hard to gain the same level of access that sites like Kotaku have had for years because we are not traditional gaming press. It's been pretty damn infuriating, and even in 2015, with the size of our channel, with hopefully the respect and credibility that our channel has earned, we still don't have pre-release access to some games. This is obviously infuriating because having pre-release access means that we can inform our viewers better, and it also means, from a purely selfish or business point of view, that we make more money. It's as simple as that. If we get a review or a piece of critique or whatever out before the game does, we will receive more views than we would were that video to be late. I'm in one of those very fortunate and rare positions where I can still release a late video and get lots of views, but I would certainly gain a boost, especially when it comes to hyped and heavily marketed titles, if I got it out prior to release. The thing is, you've got to think about exactly why a company would give pre-release access to anybody. Does it actually benefit them in any way? Well, there are certain circumstances in which it does, and there are certain circumstances in which it does not. If your game is buggy, if your game is unfinished, if your game is overhyped, if your game is lacking in promised features, then giving a pre-release review copy to pretty much anybody is a good way to not sell extra copies. In fact, it is a good way to put people off. It's a good way to get people to cancel their pre-orders, and in a culture where pre-orders are being pushed more than ever, you have to wonder why any of these companies would ever give pre-release access to anybody. Well, it's worth noting that if you don't, consumers have started to get a little bit savvy. They've started to get a little bit suspicious when pre-release reviews do not exist. They say to themselves, hang on a minute, why exactly is this information not out there already? Are they not confident in their product? It's the same thing that I was saying about Shadow of Mordor, the Warner Brothers published title. I was wondering, well, why exactly are PC users not getting access to pre-release review copies? Why is it that the only people with PC pre-release copies are those that signed a marketing agreement to basically shill for the game, to play the game for money? And it made no sense, because that game was great. Like, there was absolutely no reason for any of that. It was simply an example, I think, of Warner Brothers getting incredibly paranoid and wanting to control the message as much as possible, and that's how they chose to do it. And companies and publishers have the ability to control the message to some degree by limiting access and making sure that the people that do get access are those that are more likely to look favorably upon the title. The problem is, of course, this leads into the very, very problematic circumstance of websites and YouTubers being strongly encouraged not to be negative about these titles, because if you have a history of doing so, it is more likely that these companies will simply forget to send you a review copy early. It won't be a case of they will tell you, no, we're not giving you one because you were negative about our last game. I mean, that would be PR suicide. Why would you ever tell them that? You just simply forget to give them one, or you just don't reply to their email or whatever, and by the time that video comes out, because they had to buy a copy like everybody else, well, the positive stuff's probably already out there, and it's probably sold those launch week copies, and that happens a great deal. We've seen plenty of examples of games that come out with a great first impression, and then the problems slowly become evident, but everybody's bought it by that point, so it doesn't really matter so much to the company. Now, here's where I'm not so much going to side with Kotaku, but stand on the principle of being pro-consumer. We'll get into what Kotaku has done, maybe to deserve this, a little bit later on in this video, but I want to get this out here right now. I don't think there is a circumstance in which anybody should be celebrating a media organization being denied access. The reason I believe that is because you are simply reducing the number of opinions out there. You're reducing the amount of information for the consumer that is available out there prior to or on release. That, to me, is a net negative to consumers. It's as simple as that. That's one less organization that's likely to notice a key flaw with the game prior to release. That's one less organization that is able to get information out there that could be useful to the consumer in making an informed purchase decision. And I don't care whether or not you hate Kotaku, hate Polygon, hate whatever organization, whether it be IGN, PC Gamer, Eurogamer, me. It doesn't matter, because it's still bad for everybody if these organizations, these websites, these YouTubers are denied access. It is always good to have a breadth of opinion out there. It is always good to have more eyes and more critical eyes on the product. It is very easy to miss things. It is very easy to put yourself in a situation, for instance, where a problem with a game does not become apparent until everybody has already bought it. Prime example, Metal Gear Solid 5's ending and basically the last bit of the game is a mess. You know, it's chopped together, it's clearly not finished, and yet, of course, nobody knew that because Konami decided to put everybody through a review boot camp in order to review the game, and people didn't have enough time to beat it. These are suboptimal circumstances for reviewing a game, and yet many sites did take them up on that offer because it was either that or wait till it came out. The problem is that a lot of websites, YouTubers, whatever, are stuck at the whims of publishers. We don't actually hold that much power. The publishers pretty much hold all the cards. They can deny access until launch, and for a long time, consumers have been clamoring for review and critique content prior to release, and you can't really blame them for that. A lot of people really want to get in on day one, but of course, if they buy a bad game on day one, that's going to suck for them, so they really would like to know prior to release that that's going to happen. I think there's been a bit of a shift lately towards people who are willing to wait. I think that Steam plays into that a great deal. I think people are willing to wait for discounts, they're willing to wait for patches, and of course a couple of years of bad game releases have certainly pushed a lot of consumers to say, you know what, I don't trust you, we're going to hang on and see what everybody else thinks. Let somebody else take the bullet for me. That, I think, is a good thing in the long term. The patience of the consumer is going to take away a lot of the power that these publishers have. And honestly, when it comes to things like blacklisting and the denial of review copies, that is one of the major powers that these particular companies have. If you take away that, if you neuter their ability, you declaw their ability to hurt websites by doing so, then you take away a lot of their power over the consumer and the control that they have over the media. Here's the problem with their control over the media. We're in a position where we have to be careful sometimes as to what we say, because we risk losing access. The problem with that, of course, is that means that we can't be 100% honest all the time, because we fear losing access. There are some websites that don't care about that, and that's great. And I think that I can get away with a lot as well, because people will still watch my videos even post-launch, but I'm not going to lie when I say that it's always going to be at the back of people's mind. I'm not going to lie when I say that I've never considered that. I think that my brand is strong because I am able to say whatever I want, and I generally do. You know, I don't hold back. But I can definitely see a website that's smaller, or a YouTuber that's smaller, or that doesn't have the same sort of critical brand that I do, being a little bit careful about rocking the boat, because they don't want to lose that level of access. I think this is particularly true for websites that rely on a lot of pre-release coverage, interviews, previews, little pieces of news. You know, when I talk about a game, I generally do it once. When a website talks about a game, it can be 30, 40 articles, and each of them are getting clicks. That's the thing you got to understand about websites, is that a YouTuber can create a video, and if that video is popular, then that's the only coverage he ever needs to do on that game. He makes a decent amount of money, he moves on, and we're usually one-man band operations. In my case, our company's 3 people, and that's it. Our overheads are very, very low. A website like Kotaku has a lot of staff, and a website is not earning as much per article click as I am per video view. That means they simply need to release more stuff. It's as simple as that. And when they start to lose access, they lose the ability to release that stuff, particularly about games that people care about prior to release. And that's why you can see that websites would be a little bit scared about creating an adversarial relationship with the publisher. However, it's very important that media organizations keep these publishers and developers at arm's length. It's very important that they avoid becoming friends and covering said friends, for instance, without proper disclosure. It's very important that they don't get too chummy. It's very important that they don't simply become marketing arms for the publishers and developers, which a lot of sites are, you know. IGN is a great example of a site that has repeatedly been a marketing arm for several games. I mean, in fact, they do it as a matter of course for a lot of the popular stuff. IGN first. And how do you think they get that level of access? How do you think that they get that level of exclusivity? Why do you think there's a week's worth of content leading up to a major launch? Well, because it's a quid pro quo situation. They're given access in return for what the publishers expect, which is continued positive coverage. At that point, one has to question the independence of a website like that and say to themselves, look, are you just marketing for this game? I mean, in many ways you are, not even directly. Of course, plenty of these websites will just have banner ads and overlays for video games. I mean, that's just par for the course, unfortunately, when it comes to the business model of this industry. It's very hard to actually survive if you don't do that, but websites like IGN, and there's been plenty of other websites guilty of this, do go a step further than that. In return for access, they just keep talking about a game. They keep pushing it up there. I think it was the Shadow of Mordor debacle that I talked about a while ago that made that obvious. It's like 10 reasons to be excited for this game that we haven't played yet. A lot of this stuff is very transparent, and yet, because it's been part of the business model of websites for so long, it's expected. You know, this pre-release coverage is simply expected. It's become commonplace, and not a lot of people necessarily question it, which is unfortunate. This is one of the reasons why, even though perhaps Kotaku deserved this blacklist, I am not going to state that I'm in favor of it. One less review out on launch, one less opinion, educated opinion one would hope, out on launch is just a net negative for the consumer. I'm never going to celebrate that, you know? I'm pretty damn consistent, I think, when it comes to me being consumer first, and that driving almost everything that I do in this business. And I could not possibly be consumer first if I turn around and say, well, you deserved it, ha-ha, Kotaku. And that's not because I like Kotaku. Now, full disclosure, I speak to Jason Schreier on a semi-regular basis, and I like what Patrick Klepek writes. I've liked what he's done for a long time. I've been on his podcast once, several years ago. That's the extent of my relationship to Kotaku, and I like some of what they write. And then I despise other things that they write, and the particular style in which Kotaku presents a lot of his content I find to be objectionable. When we want to talk about the reasons that websites get blacklisted, and something that was clearly not mentioned in this article by Stephen Totilo, I'd like to take as an example an interview published in 2014 by Nathan Grayson on the site entitled "Ubisoft Refuses to Talk to Me About Women." Now, this interview was barely an interview. In fact, it wasn't. There were barely any interview questions at all. This entire article is about how Nathan Grayson claims that people in his interview were not willing to talk about, and indeed were very uncomfortable about, the subject of women in their video games. This is not a piece of journalism. This is not an interview. This is biased. This is agenda-driven, and we have nobody's word to go on other than his. Let me give you some quotes from this particular interview. It was an awkward moment as Far Cry 4 narrative director Mark Thompson and an Ubisoft PR rep nervously glanced back and forth, first at each other, then at me. Thompson looked like he wanted to say something, but he bit down on his tongue. His eyes darted down to the floor in a manner that reminded me of Wile E. Coyote stepping off a cliff and standing in mid-air for a moment, only to plummet like a cartoon anvil the second he realized there's no ground beneath his feet. What I could say is, no, I shouldn't, Thompson finally blurted out before laughing to lighten the mood. On and on and on. These are statements that cannot be corroborated. These are statements about things like body language, things that Nathan Grayson is no expert in, things that I have no reason to believe because this whole thing was never filmed. The entire article is skewed in a particular way. Even the title, "Ubisoft refused to talk to me about women," he says. As far as we know. Ubisoft was uncomfortable, as far as we know, based on his expert analysis of where people's eyes were. This is the sort of thing that will probably get you blacklisted. There is a line between being adversarial, confrontational, and doing so, of course, for the benefit of the reader, and going in there with an agenda. This is not journalism. This is, at most, yellow journalism. Journalism based on sensationalism and crude exaggeration. We have absolutely no idea how true any of this actually is. This is, by the way, not the first time that Nathan Grayson has done this. He goes into quite a few interviews with these particular questions and has caused awkward moments. Now, that does not mean that interviewers should shy away from difficult subjects. In fact, quite the opposite. But in this case, Nathan Grayson went out of his way to interpret body language, lack of things that were said, glances around a room, and all sorts of other very circumstantial and frankly irrelevant things entirely from his own perspective with no actual proof. If a company thinks that you're coming in to ambush them, if they think that you're coming in to set up a gotcha, if you're not actually interested in talking about their game, you're interested in talking about something else, then are you entirely surprised when they turn around and say, you know what, we're not actually going to give you interviews anymore? That piece is pure sensationalist pandering. It's bait. The title is designed to bait people in. It doesn't say Ubisoft interview in regards to Assassin's Creed. It doesn't even say Ubisoft interview in regards to the presence of women in video games. It literally says Ubisoft refused to talk to me about women. It's provocative. It's designed to get as many clicks in as possible. It seems to me that he's got a lot worse when it comes to this sort of thing. There's a fairly infamous interview that he did with Blizzard in 2013 for Rock Paper Shotgun, which has a more sensible title, Blizzard on Heroes of the Storm and Female Designs in MOBAs. Now, the interview is pretty good until we get down to this question that kind of comes out of absolutely nowhere about the design of various heroes in Heroes of the Storm, and he keeps hammering on about this particular subject, and the interview ends fairly shortly after that fact. Now, there was a lot of discussion around that interview as to whether he should have asked that question, whether he should not, whether he should have perhaps presented it in a different way, whether the person he was interviewing felt ambushed by that, and I think it's actually fairly safe to say that he was. But here's my particular opinion on that. I mean, if you're not given guidelines for an interview that said, hey, we're going to talk about this, we're not going to talk about this, then all this stuff is kind of fair game. I don't think that he presented it in anywhere near a constructive fashion. He was extremely adversarial. He essentially accused Blizzard and those developing this game of hypersexualizing characters, of not empowering people, and also making a statement that, frankly, doesn't really have much basis in reality, that MOBAs tend to hypersexualize female characters to a generally preposterous degree, which I do not in any way believe is true if you look at the lineup of most MOBA or Dota-style games. That still doesn't mean you shouldn't have asked the question, but here's what you gotta understand. These developers absolutely feel personally attacked when you go after them in such a way. The last thing I think that any developer wants to be called in this industry is sexist. They certainly don't want their games to be described as sexist. They don't want to have their games described as being hostile towards women and or minorities. And pieces like this do make them feel that way. You can get a lot of clicks by accusing somebody of being sexist, by accusing somebody of being racist. In many cases, I like to call these non-troversies. They're not actually important news at all, and generally speaking, they're not based on fact, merely on perception, but they get a lot of clicks, and they generate a lot of outrage, they generate a lot of discussion. Are these for the public good? Is there such a thing as public good when it comes to video games? It gets right back onto the topic of what Kotaku said in regards to sitting on leaked information. Would you ever? You should publish this, surely. Is that for the public good? Is it for the public good that they know that Fallout 4 is coming slightly earlier than they would have otherwise? Is it important that they know there's going to be another Assassin's Creed game? Well, in many cases, I think that a lot of the stuff that is published about video games is not for the public good, even from a gamer standpoint. I mean, obviously, video games are not really all that important in the grand scheme of things. They're an entertainment medium. But even within that, you've got to wonder, well, what exactly is important? What helps the consumer and what does not? I mean, are any of these interviews pro-consumer? Is this article about Ubisoft refusing to talk about women pro-consumer? No, not really. I don't think so. Was the interview with Heroes of the Storm pro-consumer? No, I don't think so. And you can argue that journalists like this are fighting for representation of women in video games, which I think is important, absolutely. We can do a better job in that regard. But they're also putting words into the mouths of players and making accusations of developers that they're alienating part of their fan base. And I think that absolutely does hurt. There's no doubt about that. Because these developers do care. They absolutely care about the people that play their games. They would never want to intentionally ostracize or make anybody uncomfortable. They want everybody to have fun. So I have to wonder what purpose an article like this actually serves. Some would argue it's holding developers to account, and yet others would argue that all it's really doing is scaring the hell out of them, you know? Who wants to try and design a female character when you have so many people just waiting in the wings to tell you why every aspect of it is problematic, or every aspect of it is somehow sexist, or how it's not good enough? It's a case of giving an inch and then people taking a mile. It's terrifying. If you keep repeatedly doing that, then of course you're going to find that developers and publishers are much less willing to talk with you. They don't want to speak to you because they feel you've got an agenda going in. You're not going to give them a fair shake. I think that's what publishers really want, is fairness. You know, that's my experience of it. I've said a lot of really bad things about games over the last 6 years, and when it comes to blacklisting, I haven't really experienced a great deal of that. I've only ever had one PR company turn around and tell me that they didn't like what I had to say And of course, that didn't go well for them. Outside of the occasional crazy indie, I think that you can be as negative as you want about a game as long as you're fair. And if you're not willing to give these companies a fair shake, then they're not willing to talk to you. I mean, why would they give you more rope by which you can hang them? They wouldn't. They're just giving you ammunition to follow whatever agenda it is that you happen to want to pursue. And it's not necessarily an agenda that is consumer-friendly. I can pursue my agenda when it comes to good ports and good PC options, and it's pretty hard to argue with any of those points. Because in the vast majority of circumstances, they're objective. They're technical. They're not based on opinion, they're based on fact. Roller Derby Nova makes female players uncomfortable is not a fact. It's an opinion, and a highly spurious one at that, as far as I'm concerned. And let's be honest, sites like Polygon, sites like Kotaku have something of a reputation for writing those kind of articles. And at that point, I have to wonder, well, where are you standing as a media organization? Are you a journalistic organization, or are you an advocacy blogger at that point? And to me, Kotaku tries to be everything. And they try to have it always. They try to have their cake and eat it. And I have no problem with them having variety on their website. And I certainly have no problem with them writing articles about this sort of thing. Write about whatever you want. Free damn country, free damn internet. And yes, some people are interested in it. And yes, frankly, there are some games that don't do a great job of representing minorities. That's a fact. But simultaneously, at that point, I can't trust you to put out a purely journalistic interview. I can't trust you to give this developer a fair shake, because you're going in there with an agenda, you're going in there with an angle, you're going in there with bias, and you're making no effort to set any of that bias aside. The kind of people, of course, that should be getting early access to video games are journalistic organizations and critics, because that's their job, to critique, to review, to get that information out to the consumer. If you're not being a journalistic organization, then of course these companies are going to turn around and say, well, you know what? We're not going to give you the credentials. We're not going to give you that press pass. That's the same reason why NeoGAF didn't get a press pass to E3. It's because they're not journalists. They're not a journalistic media organization. Why would they be given press access? That's ridiculous. Perhaps it's simply a sign of the times. There are perhaps fewer and fewer purely journalistic organizations when it comes to this particular industry. There's a lot of advocacy blogging, there's a lot of subjective opinion, and that's not necessarily bad. In fact, I actually say that it's good. I want to see more subjective opinion, which again is why I turn around and say I'm not happy that Kotaku got blacklisted, because that is one less opinion prior to launch. But you can certainly see the publisher's point, can't you? You can certainly see why publishers would not want to give this level of access to people that have repeatedly bitten the hand that fed. And that's such a dangerous statement. I don't even like saying it, because honestly, we shouldn't be in a situation where media organizations are turning around and saying, well, we've got to play by the rules. We've got to play ball with these guys. We've got to kiss the ring every once in a while. That's where bias comes from. That's where all these 8s and 9s and 10s come from. That's why so many of these websites seem unwilling to give a game anything less than an 80 if it comes from a AAA publisher, unless it's as bad as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. You know, it's got to be that awful for many of these websites to turn around and say, yeah, you know what, we're gonna rate it low. Ideally, publishers should be scared of the media and the consumer, not the other way around. Video games have had a lot of problems when it comes to that not being the case. Plenty of scandals in relation to denied access. People even losing their jobs because the relationship between publisher and developer is simply too close, because the money is coming from the very people that you're supposed to be critiquing. This industry has a ton of problems in that regard. We're not the only one. I think probably every entertainment industry has this issue. But as a consumer, I think that it would be safe to say I would never want those opinions silenced, and I would never want that information limited. I don't really care if Kotaku doesn't get to unveil the latest Hearthstone card or unveil the latest gun for a game prior to it coming out. That information is not important, but I will certainly care if they don't get a review copy. That opinion should be out there. It's useful to people. At the same time, however, I do think that to some degree Kotaku is blowing its own trumpet a little bit too much. Yes, they do publish some great journalistic pieces, absolutely. And then they publish stuff that they think is important, or they purport to be important, and yet really isn't. You know, it's just a fluff piece. If you want to publish these leaks and get a bunch of traffic that way, then I think that you run the risk. And I think that Kotaku knew the risks before they published that, and I don't think they were even surprised. They're writing an article that is trying to make them out to be the good guys, and In many ways, there are. I don't think they're villains for publishing a leak. But simultaneously, I don't think they're superheroes for it either. I don't think they did it for any other reason than to get traffic. And really, are they wrong to do so? Well, no. You know, their business model relies on getting that traffic just as everybody else does. And the reason for that is because consumers do want to read that stuff. Consumers reward leaks. They do. Consistently. Time and time and time again. They reward controversy. Time and time and time again. Do what you need to do in order to get your traffic as long as you're being honest about it. My problem is when these websites are not honest about it, and Kotaku frequently use very inflammatory titles that are sensationalized and in many ways clickbait in order to get more clicks, and actually I think that's kind of sad for them, really. It's kind of depressing that you would have to do that. I like to pride myself on the fact that people come to my channel to hear what my opinion is, and whatever the title of the video is isn't going to make a difference. I can make the most boring title imaginable, and people will come anyway because they're coming for me. And I have to wonder just how loyal a fan base, how loyal a viewer or reader base sites like Kotaku really have if they consistently have to resort to inflammatory or sensationalist titles for their articles. When you are sensationalist, when you are inflammatory, you're not as trustworthy. And if you're not trustworthy, then you can't expect publishers to play ball with you. Kotaku have proven on many occasions that they are not trustworthy, whether it be through these very biased pieces, such as Nathan Grayson's, or whether it be due to the fact that they have repeatedly covered games by developers that they have some sort of personal relationship with and have not properly disclosed that fact. Sure, they've got better over the last year, but only because they've been held under a microscope as a result of the last year's events. There is less of a line and more of a gigantic continent's worth of difference between towing the publisher line and actually being trustworthy. You do not have to be the marketing arm of a publisher. Absolutely not. There's plenty of room there, but you still have to be trustworthy. And maybe what Kotaku has realized over the past couple of years is that some publishers have ceased to view them that way. And one has to wonder if that's entirely unfair. It seems to me that Kotaku is trying to spin a great number of plates at the same time, and in this instance, perhaps they've dropped one or two. And I guess that's what happens when you try to be everything in order to make as much money as possible. If you're going to act like a tabloid, then you're probably going to be treated like one, even if that's not all that you do, and even if that's the minority of your work. You still do it. Sites like Kotaku are more often than not bloggers when it's convenient to be, journalists when it's convenient to be, critics when it's convenient to be, and I'm afraid it seems that some publishers have finally got tired of that. So no, I won't celebrate the blacklisting, even if they happen to be my competition. Yes, I do believe that less reviews out on launch is quite clearly a negative for the consumer, and that no consumer should be really celebrating this. I do feel that the vast majority of the discussion surrounding this particular issue has been based purely on whether or not you like Kotaku or hate Kotaku. It's a political thing. It's down party lines. I've seen people that have expressed their hatred for Kotaku suddenly doing a 180 simply because right now their political angle happens to align with theirs, or more accurately, they want to be opposed to people that don't like it. It's just stupid. All of this is stupid. It's ridiculous. It's been ridiculous for a long time. We are incapable of having proper, sensible, civilized, and rational discussions because of the number of appeals to emotion, the amount of tribalism, and the amount of people that simply want to talk about people and not ideas. I reject all of that. I think it's nonsense. We need to quit it. It's immature. It's pathetic. It doesn't help anybody. And I would just really love to see a more honest, more trustworthy, and more unbiased games media over the next few years. That would be great. Whether or not that's going to happen, well, who knows? Who knows? All I can say to you guys is put your money and put your clicks where your mouth is. Reward honest writing. Reward honest critique. Reward real journalism. And try your best not to fall for controversy bait, because right now, outrage is a business model. And we need to do our utmost to make it as unviable a business model as possible. It was over a year ago in a discussion with people that got me branded as an evil gamergator, as a misogynist, an MRA who hates women and all such other baseless nonsense, that I said to a number of people on a stream, I don't want to see games media burn to the ground, I want to see it get better. The way that that can happen is if good practice is rewarded by you guys and poor practice is shunned. Make no mistake though, publishers and developers are absolutely not your friend. They want your money. Of course they do. Cheering them on as they say, no, you're not going to get to review something before it comes out. I don't care how much you hate that site. That's cutting off your nose to spite your face. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a developer's games. There's nothing even wrong necessarily with being a fan, but please, please temper that. And make sure that you don't find yourself in a very unilateral relationship in which you're pouring praise and love and going to bat for a company that really only sees you as a dollar amount. Don't take up arms against people who, one would hope, are trying to protect you, who are trying to make things easier for you, who are trying to advocate for you as the consumer. What's that phrase? So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause? Not exactly a profound quote, it's from frickin' Star Wars, but let's just be careful what we cheer for in this industry. My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, feel free to click a like, and if you didn't like it, well, the dislike button is right there. I'll see you next time.